There's a moment, and I don't think I'll ever fully explain it to anyone who wasn't there, where the whole world just stops. Not slows down. Stops. Like someone pressed pause on everything except one man standing in a corridor, and a painting of a woman who was no longer alive. I keep thinking about his eyes. That's the thing that gets me. Not the argument, not the officials rushing in with their clipboards and their hushed voices. Not even the moment when everything came to a head. It was his eyes, steady, almost unbearably steady, fixed on that portrait like he was the last person on earth standing guard over something that mattered. Maybe he was. Let me tell you something about royal guards that most people don't understand. They're trained to be invisible. That's not a figure of speech. They go through months, sometimes years, of conditioning that teaches them to stand so perfectly still, to keep their faces so completely neutral, that tourists genuinely forget they're human. People walk past them like they're part of the architecture. They photograph them like they're statues. Children try to make them laugh. Drunk stag parties get inches from their faces on a Saturday night. And the guard just breathes. Stands. Exists without existing. So when a royal guard moves, when he does something outside the script, something that nobody briefed him to do, it doesn't just get your attention. It arrests it. Because you know, somewhere deep in your gut, that whatever just happened is real. Whatever this man is doing right now, he is doing it on his own, for his own reasons, and nothing about his training prepared him for it. What happened in that corridor on a cold October morning is something I've been carrying around for months now. I've told pieces of it to friends. I've started to write it down 3 or 4 times and stopped. But I think I'm ready now. I think it needs to be told properly. Setup: it was a Thursday. I remember because I'd taken the day off work, genuinely had no plans, which is rare for me, and I ended up doing what I sometimes do when I don't know what to do with myself. I went to London. Just wandered. Took the tube into Westminster and started walking, hands in my pockets, collar up against the wind. October in London has a particular quality to it. The tourists are thinner on the ground than summer, but the ones who are there feel more serious somehow. More intentional. The light is low and golden even at midday, and the city looks almost melancholy, like it's remembering something. I ended up near the Mall, walking toward Buckingham Palace, not because I had any plan to be there but because I drifted that way, the way you do in London when you're not watching where your feet are taking you. There was a small crowd gathered at the gates. There's always a crowd gathered at the gates. Some days it's enormous, tour buses and school groups and people holding selfie sticks, a whole carnival of attention. That Thursday it was modest. Maybe 40 or 50 people. A few Japanese tourists near the front with serious cameras. A young couple with a toddler in a red pushchair. Some older visitors from what sounded like the American Midwest, the husband narrating everything quietly to his wife with the patient certainty of a man who had done his research beforehand. The air smelled of damp leaves and exhaust, and somewhere nearby someone was selling hot chestnuts, that warm, slightly smoky smell that always makes London feel like itself in autumn. I stood there for a bit. Watched the guard at the gate go through his slow ceremonial turn. Took a few photographs I'll probably never look at again. And then, I decided to walk around the side toward the Royal Mews, which was open for visitors that week, and which I'd actually never been to despite living an hour outside London for most of my adult life. That's what took me around that particular corner. That's what put me in that corridor at that exact moment. If I'd had plans that Thursday, if I'd done literally anything else with my day, I would never have seen any of it. Inside the Royal Mews, the morning was quiet and unhurried. There were maybe a dozen other visitors scattered through the first section. A guide was talking softly to a couple near the state coach, her voice blending with the sound of pigeons moving restlessly somewhere in the rafters above. I drifted away from the main group, which is a habit of mine. I always end up at the edges of things, reading the plaques nobody else is reading, looking at the corners instead of the centerpieces. There was a corridor that connected one section of the building to another, and it was lined with photographs and portraits. Some of them were very old formal compositions in heavy frames, the kind of royal portraiture where everyone looks like they've been told that smiling is a form of weakness. Others were more recent. More human. And, near the end of that corridor, hung at a height that put it slightly above eye level, was a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. Not a grand state portrait. Not the kind you see on stamps or in official residences. This was something quieter. She was wearing a pale blue coat, and she was smiling, actually smiling, with her eyes, the way she sometimes did in photographs taken when she didn't quite know the camera was watching. It looked like it had been there for years. The frame had that slight softness that old gilt gets when it's been in a room for a long time. I stood in front of it for a moment. I think most people did, when they passed it. There was something about it that made you stop. The guard who was stationed at the far end of the corridor, I'll call him Thomas, because I never learned his real name and he deserves one, was young. 23, 24 at most. Tall, very upright, with the particular stillness of someone who'd been standing for a long time and had made peace with it. He wasn't part of the ceremonial guard. He wasn't in the bearskin and the red tunic. He was in a different kind of uniform, darker, more functional, the kind worn by the protection and ceremonial staff who work inside the buildings rather than at the gates. But he carried himself with the same quality. That invisible wall quality. That practiced absence. I noticed him in the way you notice furniture. Registered his presence, moved on with my eyes. That was at 10:30 in the morning. By 11, everything had changed. Build tension. I was still in the corridor. I doubled back because I wanted to look at a particular photograph of the Royal Mews in what appeared to be the 1930s when I heard voices approaching from the far end. Not loud voices. Official voices. The kind that are carefully modulated to not quite carry but somehow carry anyway. There were 3 of them. 2 were aides, I could tell by the way they moved, slightly forward-leaning, slightly deferential, carrying folders and wearing lanyards. The 3rd was a woman in a dark coat, and something about her posture, even before I had a clear look at her face, communicated authority. The uncomplicated, long-practiced authority of someone who had not needed to assert themselves in a very long time because the asserting was simply assumed. It took me a moment, and then I recognized her. I want to be careful here, because I'm aware of what I'm saying. I'm not in the habit of telling stories about members of the royal family, and I have no particular desire to cause any trouble or to pretend I know more than I do. What I'm telling you is what I saw. What I witnessed with my own eyes, standing in a corridor in the Royal Mews on a Thursday morning in October. It was Queen Consort Camilla. She was doing what I later understood to be a routine review of the facility, the kind of quiet, administrative visit that happens regularly in royal residences and institutions and rarely makes the news because it's not meant to. She was walking through with her aides, and the way she moved suggested she'd been in 100 corridors exactly like this one, and she had a list of things to attend to and a schedule to keep. She reached the portrait of Queen Elizabeth. She stopped. The aides stopped with her. There was a brief exchange, too quiet for me to hear from where I was standing, and one of the aides made a note in his folder. Nodded. They walked on. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. About 20 minutes later, as I was finally making my way toward the exit, I heard footsteps behind me, purposeful ones, coming back up the corridor. It was one of the aides. He was on his phone, talking in a low, clipped voice, and he walked past me without acknowledging my existence, which is fine and understandable but also slightly unnerving when you're not expecting it. He stopped near Thomas. He spoke briefly. I couldn't hear the words. But I saw Thomas's expression. And that was the first moment I realized something was happening. Because Thomas, this young man who had been a piece of furniture for the better part of an hour, who had achieved such perfect stillness that I had genuinely stopped registering him as a person, showed something on his face. Not a lot. Just a flicker. The way a flame moves when a window opens in a room you thought was sealed. Something had gotten in. The aide moved away. Thomas went back to standing. But he was different now. You could feel it. The quality of his stillness had changed. It had gone from the blank, maintained stillness of a man at his post to the taut, deliberate stillness of a man holding something in. Like the difference between a stone and a fist. I lingered. I know that sounds odd, and maybe it is. But I've always been good at noticing when something is about to happen, and every instinct I had was telling me to stay in that corridor a little longer. Other visitors drifted through. The Japanese tourists with their serious cameras came and went. The American couple with their patient research came and went. The toddler in the red pushchair came past and reached out toward one of the lower frames and was gently redirected by a tired but attentive father. And Thomas stood and watched the portrait. About 15 minutes after the aide had spoken to him, a facilities staff member came down the corridor with a small trolley. The kind used for moving things around inside the building. He stopped in front of the portrait of Queen Elizabeth and looked up at it, then looked at Thomas, then looked down at something in his hand, a work order, or an instruction sheet of some kind, and then looked back up at the portrait. He reached up toward the frame. Thomas said, "Don't." Just that one word. And the whole corridor seemed to hear it. I've replayed it hundreds of times in my head since that morning, and every time I replay it, I'm struck by the same thing. It wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly commanding in the way you might expect from a trained soldier who's spent years learning how to project authority. It was just certain. The facilities worker, a stocky man in his 40s, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, froze mid-reach. His fingertips were maybe 6 inches from the frame. He turned and looked at Thomas the way you look at someone when you're not sure you heard what you think you heard. Thomas was looking at the portrait. Not at the worker. Not at his feet, not at the middle distance in that unfocused way guards are trained to look. At the portrait. At her face. At that pale blue coat and those eyes that were caught in the middle of a real smile. The worker lowered his hands slowly. "Mate," he said quietly. "I've got an order." Thomas didn't move. Didn't look at him. Just said, in that same level, certain voice, "I know. They want it taken down today. I know." "I've got to know," Thomas said. "You don't." The worker stared at him. The corridor had gone completely quiet now. There were 3 or 4 other visitors still nearby and every single one of them had stopped moving. Even the pigeons in the rafters seemed to have settled. "Son," the worker said, and his voice was genuinely gentle, not condescending, the kind of son that someone uses when they're trying to help a young person avoid a mistake. "I don't want any trouble." "Neither do you. This is just a portrait. They'll put up something new. Things change, yeah?" "That's just not this one," Thomas said. The worker looked at him for a long moment. Then, he looked at the portrait. Then, back at Thomas. Something seemed to move across his face, something I couldn't quite name then, and still struggle to name now. Not pity. Not irritation. Something softer than both of those. He stepped back from the portrait. "I'm going to have to report this," he said. "I know," Thomas said, for the 3rd time. The worker left. And Thomas stood. I should explain, or try to explain, why nobody who was watching that exchange did anything to intervene or to move things along. Why we all just stood there. Part of it was simple surprise. You don't expect a royal guard to refuse an instruction in front of a roomful of strangers. You don't expect that kind of visible, personal resistance from someone whose entire professional identity is built on discipline and compliance. But, I think it was more than surprise. There was something about the way Thomas was standing in that moment that made you feel, almost physically, that what was happening mattered. That it was right for it to be witnessed. That this small corridor in this slightly overlooked building was briefly somewhere that counted. I've thought about this a lot. About why grief sometimes finds strange containers. About why people hold on to certain things, photographs, habits, places, not because they're rational but because they're true. Because letting them go would be admitting something the heart isn't ready to admit yet. Thomas was young enough that Queen Elizabeth II had been queen for his entire life. She had been the constant. The given. The thing that was simply always there, the way certain sounds and seasons and landmarks are always there, so present and so permanent that you stop registering them until they're gone and, suddenly, the world has a shape it didn't have before, a shape defined by absence. I don't know if he'd ever met her. I don't know if he'd ever been anywhere close to her. But she had been his queen. She had been the thing the uniform meant. And now someone wanted to take down her portrait, and he had decided, quietly, alone, with no backup and no plan, that this was not going to happen on his watch. That's what I was watching. That's why I couldn't move. The aide came back. This time he had two people with him, a senior-looking woman in a gray suit who had the air of someone who managed things, and a security officer who was built like a wardrobe and moved like someone who'd been briefed that there might be a situation. They came down the corridor with the careful pace of people who are trying not to make a situation worse by how they're approaching it. The aide stopped a few feet from Thomas. "Guardsman," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, not anger, more like someone trying to keep a lid on a pot that's starting to rattle. "You've been asked to stand down on this. The portrait is being relocated." Thomas said nothing. "The decision has been made at a senior level. This isn't a request." Thomas looked at the aide. For the first time since I'd started watching him, he moved his gaze off the portrait. He looked directly at the aide, and the aide, a man who worked in one of the most powerful households in the country, a man who was certainly more senior and certainly better connected, took a small, involuntary half-step back. "With respect," Thomas said, "she was the queen." "The king's household, she was the queen," Thomas said again. "Quiet. Immovable. She served for 70 years. This portrait has hung in this corridor. It hasn't bothered anyone. It doesn't need to come down today." The aide glanced at the woman in the gray suit. She looked at Thomas. She looked at the portrait. She looked at the small cluster of visitors who were all, and she must have registered this, watching with complete and total attention. She made a small sound, not quite a sigh, not quite a word. "Guardsman," the aide tried again. "I need you to understand." "I understand," Thomas said. "I understand all of it. I'm asking you to leave the portrait where it is." There was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then, the security officer took a step forward. And something happened that I didn't expect. The American man, the one who'd been narrating everything to his wife, the one with the patient research and the careful voice, said, loudly and clearly, from where he was standing about 10 feet away, "Son, I want you to know we're all watching." Just that. No accusation. No aggression. Just a statement of fact delivered with quiet Midwestern weight. "We are here, we are witnesses, and what happens next is going to be what happened." The aide looked at the American man. The security officer looked at him. The woman in the gray suit looked at him and, then, at the other visitors, the Japanese tourists with their cameras, the young couple with the toddler, me taking a quick inventory of the room. Thomas didn't look at anyone. He'd gone back to looking at the portrait. The aide murmured something to the woman in the gray suit. She murmured something back. The security officer stood very still with his arms at his sides. Then, without any announcement or explanation, all three of them left. The corridor was quiet again. The worker's trolley sat empty near the wall where he'd parked it. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, that pale blue coat, those smiling eyes, remained exactly where it had always been. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. That's important, I think. In a film, this would be the moment for that, for the catharsis, for the release, for the crowd to have its collective exhale and let the moment become something celebratory. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, I think, more real than that. The American man nodded, a single, slow, affirming nod, the way someone nods when something has confirmed what they hoped was true about the world. The Japanese tourists lowered their cameras. One of them, a young woman, looked at the portrait and then at Thomas and then back at the portrait and put her hand briefly to her mouth. The young mother with the toddler said something very quietly to her partner, and he reached over and took her hand. I just stood there. Thomas stood at his post. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody thanked him. Nobody made any kind of formal acknowledgement that anything extraordinary had just happened. He stood at the end of that corridor with his hands at his sides and his face composed and his eyes on that portrait, and he did what he had always been trained to do. He kept watch. I left about 10 minutes later. I don't know why I stayed that long, habit, maybe, or the strange reluctance to walk away from something that still felt unfinished. As I passed the portrait on my way out, I stopped for a moment. Looked at it properly. I mean properly, the way Thomas had been looking at it. Not as a piece of royal history or a decorative element or a backdrop for a photograph. Just as a picture of a woman. A woman who had been in her 90s and who had spent most of her life doing a job that nobody had asked her to want, who had been photographed tens of thousands of times and met millions of people and carried an extraordinary amount of weight with what appeared, on most available evidence, to be genuine grace. A woman who was gone. Whose portrait hung in a corridor, and who still, in some way I can't fully explain, seemed to be looking back. I walked out into the October light. The pigeons were on the rooftop. The chestnuts still smelled warm and smoky from somewhere up the road. A group of schoolchildren was filing past in a crocodile line, their high voices bright and clear in the cold air. I put my hands in my pockets and I walked. I told my friend about it that evening over dinner. She listened the whole way through without interrupting, which isn't usually her style. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "Do you think he knew what he was risking?" I thought about that for a while. "Yes," I said. "I think he knew exactly what he was risking. I think that's why he did it." She nodded. Looked down at her plate. Then, looked up. "Good," she said. "That matters. When people know what something costs and they do it anyway. That matters." I agreed with her. I still do. I didn't go back for a while. 3 months, maybe. The weather had turned properly cold by then, January cold, the kind that makes London look cleaned out, like someone's gone through it with a stiff brush and left nothing soft anywhere. I had business near Victoria and I decided, on the way back to the Tube, to walk past the Royal Mews. I'm not entirely sure what I was expecting. Or what I was hoping to find. I think, on some level, I wanted to know if the portrait was still there. It was a Tuesday, this time. Mid-morning, overcast, the sky the same flat gray it stays all January. The Royal Mews was open, it opens most days, and there were very few visitors. A retired couple, moving slowly and happily through the coach display. A young man sketching something in a notebook near the far wall, the particular absorbed quality of someone who regularly uses drawing as a way to be inside themselves. The corridor was empty of people. I walked its length slowly, past the old photographs and the formal portraits, past the 1930s photograph of the stables that I doubled back to look at in October, past the heavy frames with their slightly softened gilt. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth II was still there. I can't tell you why that made me feel what it made me feel. I'm not even entirely sure I could name it if I tried. Relief, partly. And something else. Something to do with the idea that certain things, certain quiet, specific, human things, are more durable than they look. That they sometimes survive what shouldn't survive them. The portrait was still there, in its place, at that slightly above eye level height that made you tilt your chin up to meet her gaze. The pale blue coat. The real smile. The eyes that looked like they were mid-conversation with someone just beyond the edge of the frame. I stood in front of it for a bit longer than was probably sensible. There was a guard at the end of the corridor. Not Thomas. A different one, older, broader, with a gray-flecked close-cropped beard and the same practiced stillness. I didn't know him. He didn't know me. But I noticed, as I turned to leave, that he was looking at the portrait with an expression that took me a moment to place. Familiarity. The specific ease and warmth of looking at something you have looked at many, many times. The way you look at a view from a window you know well, or a photograph on a shelf that you've stopped consciously seeing but would notice the absence of immediately. He was looking at it like it belonged there. I've thought a lot about what Thomas was doing, what he understood himself to be doing, in that corridor in October. I don't think it was about defiance, exactly. I don't think he woke up that morning and decided he was going to challenge anyone. I don't think he went into that building with any kind of agenda. I think he was just standing at his post. And, when someone came to take something down that he believed should stay up, he responded the way his character, not his training, not his orders, his character, told him to respond. He said, "Not this. Not here. Not today." There's a tradition in the royal household, in the British Armed Forces more broadly, actually, of what you might call silent loyalty. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up in small moments, in unremarkable corridors, in the decisions that nobody sees coming because nobody thought they needed to plan for them. The kind that doesn't need to make a speech because the act itself is the speech. Thomas didn't make a speech. He stood still. And, in standing still, he said everything. I want to be honest about something. I've had conversations since October with friends, with colleagues, with my sister who works in a place where protocol and hierarchy matter enormously about whether what Thomas did was right. Whether a soldier refusing an order, even a relatively minor institutional order, is ever the correct thing. Whether the individual conscience should override the chain of command, and where you draw that line, and whether drawing it at a portrait in a corridor is drawing it in the right place. These are legitimate questions. I'm not dismissing them. My sister, who is not sentimental and has no patience for what she calls emotional reasoning, made the point that institutions need discipline to function. That if every soldier refused every instruction that didn't sit well with them personally, you'd have chaos rather than an organization. That loyalty to a fallen monarch, however genuine, doesn't supersede the legitimate authority of a living one. She's not wrong about any of that. And, yet, there's something I keep coming back to. Something I've not been able to argue myself out of, no matter how many reasonable counterarguments I line up against it. Thomas was not refusing a military order. He was not refusing a command from a superior officer in a situation with any operational consequence. He was refusing the removal of a painting from a wall in a corridor. A painting of a woman who had, by every account I've ever encountered, been genuinely beloved by a significant portion of the people who served in and around the institution to which Thomas had given his professional life. He was saying, she deserves to stay here a little longer. She has not been here long enough. The world outside has already moved on. Give us this one corridor, this one quiet space, to let the transition happen at its own pace. That's not insubordination. That's grief. And, grief, in my experience, is one of the very few things in human life that has a completely legitimate claim on being irrational. The aftermath in the weeks after that Thursday, I did some careful searching in news sites, royal correspondent columns, the kind of detailed coverage that comes from people who follow the monarchy the way sports journalists follow a club. There was nothing. Not a word. Which is, I suppose, not surprising. These things don't make the papers. A young guard holding his position over a portrait in a quiet corridor isn't front-page news, or even back-page news. It's the kind of thing that happens inside institutions all the time, small acts of personal conviction that don't fit neatly into any narrative and, so don't get reported, that live instead in the memories of the people who happen to be standing in the right corridor at the right time. I was the right corridor at the right time. I've accepted that this story belongs to me in that particular way, not because I was important to it, not because I played any role in it, but because I saw it. Because I was given the chance, on an ordinary Thursday when I had nothing better to do, to watch a young man in a dark uniform stand between a portrait and a trolley and say, simply and clearly and without any fuss, no. That's mine. That particular Tuesday of a moment is mine, and I've been carrying it around, and I needed eventually, finally, to put it down somewhere. Here seems like the right place. I wonder about Thomas sometimes. Whether he faced any formal consequence. Whether there was a disciplinary meeting, a quiet reprimand, a note placed in a file somewhere in a building that smells of old polish and institutional patience. I hope not. But, I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that when I went back in January, the portrait was still there. And, the guard on duty, whoever he was, whatever his story, was looking at it with the easy, familiar regard of someone who saw it as part of the landscape. Part of the given. Maybe Thomas's refusal had a ripple. Maybe someone higher up the chain, looking at the situation from a small distance, decided that the portrait could stay, that the cost of its removal, measured in the kind of currency institutions don't formally account for but absolutely feel, was higher than the cost of leaving it. Maybe they thought about the Americans who'd said we're all watching, and the cameras of the Japanese tourists, and decided that some hills are not worth taking. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe someone walked past it one morning and looked at it the same way Thomas had looked at it, and thought, this stays. Maybe that's all it took. The last time I was in that corridor, I'd been twice since January, because I've become a person who has a complicated relationship with a corridor in the Royal Mews, which is not something I ever expected to say about myself. The light was different. It was spring by then, and the light came through a window at the far end at a low angle and hit the portrait in a way that made the gilt of the frame do something warm and complicated. There were children in the corridor. A school group, very young, 6 or 7 years old, trailing behind a patient teacher who was telling them about the history of the carriages in the next room. Most of them weren't paying attention in the way children don't pay attention when the adult is talking about something they haven't yet decided matters. But one of them stopped in front of the portrait. A girl. Dark hair in 2 plaits. A red anorak with a small unicorn badge on the lapel. She stood in front of it with her hands clasped behind her back, the posture children adopt, sometimes, when they're looking at something they instinctively know requires a certain seriousness. She looked at it for a long moment. Long enough that the teacher had noticed she'd fallen behind and was waiting patiently at the edge of the group. Then, the girl said, quietly but clearly, she looks like she's about to tell you something nice. The teacher smiled. The girl looked at the portrait for another second. Then, she ran to catch up with the group, her plates bouncing, her unicorn badge catching the light. And the portrait watched her go, which is what portraits do, they stay in one place while everything else moves around them. They hold the moment they were made in while time keeps accumulating outside their frame. They are, in their way, a kind of keeping faith with someone who is no longer there to speak for themselves. Thomas understood that. He understood it in whatever language loyalty speaks when words run out, in the language of a young man standing perfectly still at the end of a corridor, his hands at his sides, his eyes on a painting, saying with everything he had, she mattered. She still matters. And I'm not moving. Ending. I don't know Thomas's name. I don't know if he kept his job, or where he is now, or whether he ever thinks about that Thursday morning in October. Whether it's a thing he carries the way I carry it, or whether it's just a morning he had once, a morning when something in him rose to meet something that needed meeting, and then, life continued, and that was that. I hope he knows, somehow, impossibly, in the way that certain truths find their way to the people who need to hear them, that what he did was witnessed. That it was seen. That there was a woman standing in a corridor with her hands in her pockets and her plans cancelled and nothing particular to do, who watched him hold his ground, and who has been thinking about it ever since. I hope he knows that it mattered. Not because it changed anything large. Not because it shifted the course of history or altered the working of an institution or accomplished anything that will ever appear in a book or a newspaper or an official record. But because mattering doesn't require scale. Sometimes it just requires a man at his post, in a corridor, in the quiet middle of an ordinary Thursday, who looked at the face of someone he had served and decided, without drama, without calculation, without any plan at all, that she had not yet been given quite enough time. And so he gave it to her. That's all. That's everything. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth II still hangs in that corridor. The gilt of the frame is as soft as it was. The pale blue coat is as pale. The smile is the same smile, caught in the middle of something warm, directed at someone just beyond the edge of what the painter could reach. She looks, as a small girl in a red anorak once said, like she's about to tell you something nice. Maybe she is. Maybe some portraits hold more than paint.